Bonsoir les amis, this is Llyane Stanfield, and today, I would like to answer the question that Bob asked, and as well as Les pointed out a few other issues that you may have regarding the reflexive verbs. So thank you so much for the question, Bob. I really appreciate it. Any question, please go ahead and ask. The more details, the better. And it may seem illogical, or maybe no, you don't quite understand this. Why do I need that many details? It is because everybody is different, and what makes sense to you personally may not make sense for someone else, for Les, for instance, and what makes sense to Les may not make sense to you. And my style, my method is one-on-one, and so I'm doing my best here in the group to answer everybody's questions in such a manner that can actually help everybody. So it's kind of it's a very fine line to write for me. And this is the reason I'm asking you a ton of questions to get much more about details, and as well as your level and where you stand and how do you see things. So I do want to emphasize once more that in this group you will not see a ton of links and a ton of information. This is the danger, number one danger that can can happen when you learn the language, because everywhere you are bombarded with information. I'm learning Italian, and I know I just get overwhelmed right away. So I will always tend, you'll notice, I will always tend to strip down, to go to the core basics, and to make it much simpler, as simple as possible. It is so important for you to know how to make it non-overwhelming. So it has to feel simple or simpler when I am explaining than before. So I'm going to, for those of you who didn't follow that thread, I'm going to read. So he says, I would like to suggest a topic, if I may. Reflexive verbs are a difficult concept to grasp. Whether or not a verb is reflexive, sometimes it is obvious. For instance, verb to wash, laver. If I say je lave la vaisselle, it makes sense. I understand why je me lave les mains is reflexive. It is an action to myself. However, je me souviens de cette voiture does not make sense to me. It's like saying I remember myself that car instead of I remember. I guess my question is, are there any clues to tell us which verbs are reflexive or not? Or is it merely a case of memorizing which verbs are reflexive and which are not? And I will also want to, because Bob also pointed out the fact that I'm also going to answer later the second question that Bob asked, and that is about pronunciation, meaning he is not sure how to pronounce a word, and then when he's looking it up is really logical. Oh my God, how did I not think about it? So I'm going to talk a little more about that as well. So again, this is a disclaimer. My work is always one-on-one. This group is to show you, to give you techniques and tips that will help you continue learning the French language, and also to see how I am working, what my method is, and what my tips would be should you work with me. And of course, you don't have to work with me before I give you these tips. However, the answer that I'm giving right now may cover kind of, I don't know, 25%, 50%, 75%, I don't know, because I don't have Bob's feedback. I would love if we could, for instance, do that. I would definitely love it. I'm looking into this right now, and I'm hoping to have people willing to do this with me, because that also sometimes was, one second, kind of hard to find someone to work with on video, on camera. Meaning, if I had Bob with me right now, I have, for instance, we could do Zoom, and if we could work together, he'd ask me the question and I'll answer, and I'll probe, and I'll actually give him the exact answer that he personally needs. Everybody's different. And then you will see how I would work if I would be working with you. How would I help you find the exact technique that works with you and with you only? Of course, techniques work with more people, but the application typically is it's different from a person to another. So I'm going to strip it down. I'm going to simplify to the core, and let's first see what is a reflexive verb. So a reflexive verb is a verb that that has the effect on the subject. So like the question, sorry, the example that you gave there. So I wash, je lave la vaisselle. I wash the, how do you say that in English? The cutlery, or whatever, the dishes. I wash the dishes, sorry, I draw a blank. So I wash the dishes, je lave la vaisselle. Look at it this way. The action is the verb. And if you know what a vector is, that's the best. And many of you are professionals, and some engineers too. And so, but that is taught, I think, in high school. So if you don't know, that's fine too. I'm going to explain. So if you know what a vector is an arrow. That the characteristics of this arrow is a point of start, a value, which is the length of the arrow, and the direction. And that's an action, that's a force, right? So whenever you pull something or you push something, you know where it starts from and where it goes, the direction, as well as the value of the force, if it's like a slow push or a fast push, right? A strong push. So if you compare an action with this, and well, in that disclaimer I should say my explanations are really different than anybody else's, okay? So I'm quite visual, and very soon I'm probably going to show drawings and stuff like that. When I teach, I'm actually showing drawings. So if the action, any action, except for to be, most of the verbs are showing an actual action, that kind of a move, change of some sort. So if an action is a vector, like an arrow, then you know where it originates. It originates from the subject. So, for instance, je lave la vaisselle, I wash the dishes. Who washes the dishes? Where does it start from? Je, right? The subject initiates the action. So the subject, it's actually the originator of the action, of the verb. Now, je lave la vaisselle. Who gets washed? La vaisselle. So the dishes. So my actions, so the action is the arrow, starts from me and goes to the dishes. So if the dishes are washed, this is an active voice, is the active voice, meaning the subject is active. The subject did something and something else got the effect of the action. The subject did the action of the verb, and the effect of that verb is onto something else, which is the object. That's the active voice. The reflexive voice is je me lave. I wash myself. So now imagine that same vector, that same arrow, that I'm holding it in my hand. I'm the subject, I'm washing, right? And so I'm throwing it in the mirror, and the action reflects right back onto me. Who originated the action? The vector, the arrow was thrown by me. So who originated the action of the verb was the subject. Who got washed? Who got wet with water? The subject. This is why we're calling it reflexive. Just wanted to make this because the answers cannot be, I'm making my answers such that they're helpful for most of the people in the group. So this is what a reflexive verb is. When the action reflects onto the subject, when the subject and the object are the same. I'm washing and I'm the one washed. So both the subject and the object are the same. Then there is that, and this is the reflexive voice. That's the reflexive voice. There is a third voice that is called the passive voice. And I'm going to say in this sentence, in the example that Bob gave, La vaisselle est lavée par moi. The dishes are washed by me. Now, why is it called passive? Because the subject is la vaisselle. Grammatically, the subject is la vaisselle. However, who does the washing? I do the washing. But who is washed? Who gets wet and washed? La vaisselle, the dishes. Meaning that the dishes are actually the grammatical subject is passive. It's not them doing the action of the verb. They're not moving. They're just sitting there getting washed. That is this is the passive voice. Both passive and reflexive voices are conjugated with être, okay? Going down to very, very simple. Now, what I want to explain to everybody whose mother tongue is English, or who doesn't yet think, whose mother tongue is English. Because if your mother tongue is Spanish, you do get this, you do get what I'm about to say. In English, when I say I wash, the default is reflexive. I'm going to say this again. In English, when I am saying I wash, you'll have a picture of yourself in your mind that I am washing my own body, myself. In French, when I say je lave, is the active mode. So when I say je lave in French, if you stop there, je lave, I'm going to say, what are you washing? So I'm going to say this again. In English, when I say I wash, it defaults to reflexive. So in English, reflexive is hidden, is not obvious, because I don't have to say anything. There's no, je dois rien préciser. I don't have to specify anything. In English, they have a reflexive. And this is the core reason with the confusion about the reflexive mode. So, in French, however, I specify everything. So, let's go back to English though. So, the default, if I say I wash, it means I wash myself. It's me who's getting washed. If I'm washing something or someone else, I'm going to have to specify that. Only then do I have to specify. I'm going to say, I wash my dog, I wash my dog, I wash my daughter, or I wash the dish. So that is specified, right? It's the only way to actually say it in English, right? But when I say I wash, it means that I wash myself. And this is the reason why in French now all of a sudden I specify reflexive. So you give here an example, je me souviens, I remember. Well, and that's because in English I don't have to say anything additional. I remember me, right, myself. I remember myself. There's nobody else involved when I say I remember. English also has, well, what English has though, in English we have different words for a different context. So when I remember myself, I'm saying I remember. I don't have to say myself. I don't have to say I remember myself in English. If I do the same action of remembering, to someone else, so it's the active mode, I'm not using the verb remember anymore, I'm using the verb remind. So English is intrinsic, as in like English, each word in English is self-sufficient, gives the context. I remember means the reflexive. I remind is the active voice. So this is a very interesting way to look at things, right? And so I know as a person whose mother tongue is English, you don't get to break down as much your mother tongue as you have to when you have to match with the equivalent in French. In French, however, we're doing this in a different way. I'm using souvenir. Or I'm not necessarily going to use, I'm thinking of souvenir. Les souvenirs, yeah. So we're using a verb, the same verb, but I'm going to say reflexive. I'm going to use the reflexive if it's about me, and I'm going to use the active mode if it's about you, right? So I'm going to go back to laver. Je me lave means I wash. And you understand that this is an action onto yourself. That's true, but even I remember is an action on myself. Je me souviens is an action on me. I'm not reminding someone else. I'm remembering myself, right? Or I remind myself, but I remember is an action in myself. Now, yes, there is a memorization that you'll have to do, right? To see, but not all of them, all of the verbs, not all of them. So some of them are more intuitively reflexive for the English speaking people, right? More intuitive, as in like, yeah, I understand because I wash myself, that means that it's an action done unto myself. And so I'm going to see if I want to go into more examples. Going into more examples, and let's actually give you and us, all of us, a link. And I looked it up, and in that link it gives so much information, so many examples, which the examples are okay, and those examples can be found anywhere. But the problem with that link was that, and I asked him to remove it just so that we don't get even more overwhelmed. The problem with that link was that it was getting into much more grammar. That it was like, oh Jesus Christ, do I have to learn this and this and this and this and this list, and oh my God, right? I have to memorize everything. So I'm trying to make it logical for you to kind of get the subtext, the connotation, which is the more important part, and the fact that English has kind of an invisible reflexive, and that's why reflexive in French is a little harder. Yeah, I actually wanted to looking at me, there was something that I wanted to, oh yeah, so we have reflexive, where I am throwing the arrow in the mirror and the action goes on to me, and I have reciprocal, which I'm sure you understand that, we're doing one to the other. An action, ils se battent, for instance, they beat each other up, right? And so then there are, in this link, I'm just looking, really, because they say it's like the idiomatic, so idiomatic meaning, well, you have to memorize that, right? However, there are so many in the list of this idiomatic, and you can Google search, I'm sure you're going to find that, right, in idiomatic reflexives. Look them up and find in Google, and you'll find any lists. There are like tons, like millions of lists and resources out there. And look up now, knowing what I told you, and see, for instance, in the idiomatic reflexives, how many of them actually will make now sense to be on myself, like action onto myself. S'endormir, it's so clear. S'endormir, I sleep, myself, you know. So yeah, there is a part of there is memorization, it's always going to be, but there is always a part in French, a part of the meaning of the word that you will see that has that kind of nugget of reflexive that is done onto myself. And so that's going to be a big part, a large part of the verbs that are called idiomatic. And you may be tempted to, oh, okay, those are idiomatic. So if they are idiomatic, that means, well, now I just have to memorize and I'm done. But now I really want you to really analyze and see each and every one of them, because more I'm looking at the list. Se fâcher, to get mad, well, I get mad myself, right? So I'm not getting you mad, you see. So interesting to see. Now, from this perspective, from this prism, now how many of the verbs are left to just memorize, that are just not making sense to be onto myself, right? So I would like to see, again, I would love to have a conversation here. I really want you to know that I want to have Q&A, like live, or I don't know if they're going to be live, they may be recorded, but to have Bob, for instance, here, or Les, or any other person who would love to ask questions, and to be a back and forth, so that gradually I give the technique that works for that person specifically. And now the answer I gave today was such constructed such that it's less overwhelming, strip down all the rules and everything that, you know, may complicate things. I want you to memorize as little as possible, and I'm always ready to create for you any back-end story, any backstory, to help you actually have a picture in your mind that will make your, well, it's eventually still going to be a memorization of some sort, but to make it much easier and logical, make it logical rather than, oh my God, like I have, keep remembering this, one of my dear clients, she came to me learning 100 words a day, and I was, well, what do you do with them, right? It's important what you do with them. So do less, better. Use less words, better, in a better way. In French is possible. So in French, I don't need a contextual, necessarily a contextual word to be to conduct a really beautiful, sophisticated conversation. It can be manipulation, can be through the sentence and using that word the right way, in, you know, with the connotation that has and all that. So, and now the second point of today's Q&A was still Bob's. Thank you so much, Bob, for these questions. I adore them. Let me see if I can actually see it. It was about pronunciation. Let me see. No, I don't. Yeah, it's here. It's right here, but I'm not sure exactly. I'm going to paraphrase. So he says that many times he looks for words and not knowing how they are pronounced, and he looks them up. And the moment he looks them up, he's like, damn, of course, duh, of course I know this, I knew this, it's so familiar, how come I didn't actually know how to pronounce it from the get-go? So what happens is this. It is about the rules of pronunciation, and nobody that I know teaches all the rules of pronunciation. I have a pronunciation course, and you learn this in like 4 hours, you can be done. Not that you will actually have them naturally, right, and can come to you in conversation. However, when you slow down enough, you are going to be able to use the pronunciation rules in everything, in reading, writing, as well as in conversation. So, what happens is this. Most people are learning to pronounce the words by ear, as the way you hear them. And that's what's happening in English. We are learning the words most of the times from someone who said them before, like tear and tear. Why do I say tear? Why do I say tear? I have to remember. They're written the same way. I have to remember which one's pronounced which way for which context, right? And so in French we don't have that. But what we do have, we have these rules of pronunciation. And there are, including the alphabet, 70 some rules of pronunciation. So knowing them, then you will be able to, when you see the word, you will be able to know how to pronounce. Now, because my explanation there was about the commonly used words, and it's a little bit more like meat in this explanation, I'm going to say this. We do have exceptions, and the exceptions, most of the exceptions are most commonly used words. So why am I saying this? Like, imagine like a sweater that you're wearing day in and day out. It's going to change shape. So what happens with the most commonly used words, verbs included and verb conjugation included, they are changing because many people are using them all the time. And so typically some people couldn't care less if the school said whatever way. They may not even have gotten to go to school, and so they say the words however it is that sounds easier, that's pronounced easier. And so those are going to be the exceptions. And because of that, the most commonly used words have to be memorized. Most of them, right? Well, I mean, sort of all of them. Like, so if you start from absolute zero, whoever is here in the group that starts from absolute zero, you have to memorize the most commonly used words that are exceptions. But the good news is that all the programs in the entire world of learning the language will contain these most commonly used words, because we start learning the language with the most commonly used words. You start the language conjugating the verb avoir and être. They are the absolute most irregular verbs in the entire grammar. Why are we starting with them? Because we use them the most. And so that's exactly what happens with the other words, with nouns and other words and adjectives, whatever. So, now, with the other words that are not most commonly used words, I'm not saying that all the most commonly used words are exceptions. What I am saying is that all exceptions, or big majority of the exceptions, are most commonly part of the most commonly used vocabulary. Now, with the rest of the vocabulary, which is, okay, how much? Well, I'm going to say, I'm hearing the question, okay, so how much percent? I'm going to say 80%. I'm going to say 80%. That you're all covered, 85% you are covered when knowing the rules of pronunciation. So, when you start learning the rules of pronunciation, but you already learn words how to pronounce because you heard them a lot, what I recommend that you do is, again, I don't know, I mean, some people here I know for a fact that already finished the pronunciation course with me, but some people didn't. So now, if you did learn all the rules of pronunciation, what you should do, if you are still have a problem with some words that you're not sure how to pronounce, and then you look them up and they feel familiar. If you do know all the rules of pronunciation, what I want you to do is to look at that word that felt familiar, but you had to look it up, and see why are you pronouncing this? What rules of pronunciation do you apply there? If you do not know the rules of pronunciation, you'll have to kind of rediscover the wheel. And you will have to look at other words that you know, that sound, that have kind of the same groups of sounds, kind of the same thing, and look at the pattern and see if belle is pronounced belle, then appel is going to be pronounced appel, right? Because it's a double L, E before double L. Oh, I don't have an accent, but apparently if I have two L's after E, I'm saying E, I'm not saying E. And here I told you a pronunciation rule, right? So this is what I do recommend to you. If you don't want to do the pronunciation course, then do that. It's going to take much longer, much longer, because you're going to have to discover on your own. Based on and I see that you are intermediates, and so you have quite a vocabulary now. So with the words that don't quite make sense, but when you look them up, they sound familiar. Look and see what is the pattern what is in common between this word and another word. What do they have in common as pattern? Can I actually make the rule of pronunciation that is used there, so that you don't have to look it up again in the future? So I hope that this gave you two techniques, more unorthodox, and maybe you don't find this anywhere, and this is kind of my way to explain something that takes you out of what you were doing. Because if you kept doing things a certain way and you keep getting the same results that you're not quite happy with, it is time for you to change the way you do things. So for that reason, I invite you to contact me and to have one of my free rendezvous, where I am going to share with you and to guide you into finding exactly what techniques would work with you or for you and only you. And you have to just contact me. You can PM, private message me, and I'm looking forward to having you one-on-one and to work together on any of these annoying challenges that keep coming back, and regardless of how much you work on them. So I hope that this helped everybody, or most of the people. Please write in the comments below any other questions that follow-up questions that you have. Stay on your game and keep going for your dream to become bilingual. Learn to speak Parisian French and break your language barrier. Merci beaucoup et à la prochaine.